Now, we worked with the debugger a bit, and after this lecture, you'll also find a lecture with a link to a more detailed explanation of the debugging capabilities Visual Studio Code gives you. Don't learn them by heart, but feel free to explore them to get the most out of the debugger for you. Now, there are two things I want to show you or I want to draw your attention to. One is something you already saw. Let's add a breakpoint again, and again submit this. I already showed you that you can execute code here in that debug console at the bottom. So you don't just see the console logs here, you can also execute code here. For example, you can type a variable name here, so something which is available in your code at this point of time. In general, something which you can find in local or in block here or in global. So the things you find here, like message, you can also type that down there and hit enter to print its value. And this is of course not really useful for printing because you can see the value on the left too. But as I showed you for parsed body, you cannot just print the value, you can also run operations on it that will not affect your code as it's running, but that will allow you to look into it or try out some transformation before you add it to your real code. So whatever you run down there does not affect the code you run up here, but it is nice for you to understand your code. The other thing I want to show you is that for now, at the moment, if we change something in our code here, let's say we add a blank line, our debugger doesn't restart. But with NodeMon, we actually have a package that does allow us to restart. So it would be nice if the debugger would also restart if we change our code. Otherwise, it just behaves differently than the rest of our app, and we have to restart it manually. Now, to restart it, let's go back to the Explorer view for a second. We have to go to Debug and then add a configuration for Node.js. This adds the .vscode folder with the launch.json file. And this allows you to configure debugging for this project and how it behaves. You can click on Add Configuration to see some demo settings you can add, but you can also just type in there. And one setting you can add is Restart, and you can set it to True. You just have to make sure that you also add some other fields. For example, you have to make sure that NodeMon is used. And for that, you set the runtime executable not to Node, which would be the default, but to NodeMon here. So now it will use NodeMon and it will restart the debugger when a change is detected, so that not just the server is restarted, but also the debugging process. Here, by the way, in this configuration, you can also define that it should always start with the app.js file, so that you can even have the routes.js file selected while starting debugging, and it will still go for the app.js file, which is more convenient than always selecting the file you want to debug first before starting the debugger. And you always have to pick the app.js file because that starts your server. So you can't say, I want to look into the routes.js file, so I'll start with that. It always has to be the app.js file because you always have to start the entire server. So here you can define that it will always pick that no matter which file you have currently open. You can also change the console where things are logged to the integrated terminal, which is the normal terminal. With this, if you save all of that and you now start debugging, it fails though. And the reason for this is that it will not use the local NodeMon, but it looks for it globally. Now to add it globally, you have to run npm install NodeMon-g. And now important, on Mac and Linux, you might need to add sudo in front of this. On Windows you don't, to get the right permissions to install this. With that, you might be prompted for your password. And now it will install NodeMon globally, which makes sure that if you ever run NodeMon in the terminal now, it will not fail with a not found error, but instead it will find it. And therefore now you can also run in this debugger here, which will use the global version. And you see it now opens the terminal, starts NodeMon. And if you now add a breakpoint somewhere and submit this again, it still works as before. Just important, you now see the terminal here logs all the things. You can still use the debug console to output message though. So you can still work with this as I showed it to you. So this is not stopped from working. This still is something you can use. But in the terminal, you get the normal output. And you have to use the terminal because if you now change something it restarts the debugger and node, and these are two separate processes. And if you stop the debugger, NodeMon has to quit separately or has to exit separately. And you do this by hitting Control-C here. And this couldn't be done in the debug console, which is why you have to funnel this to the terminal. So that's just something to keep in mind. You have to stop that process separately, which you can do from the terminal, which is why if you're using that NodeMon process, you should use the integrated terminal. And you can read more about that in that detailed Visual Studio Code debugging article. But now you have a setup where you have a debugger attached to your program that will restart if you added something, where the server will restart if you added something, and where you have now all the tools you should need to debug your Node app and hopefully solve any errors you get. Now, one important note, for the rest of the course, I'll mostly use npm start and not have the debugger attached all the time. I will only use that if there is some error I wanna particularly debug with the debugger and wanna find with the debugger. So you can use it as a default always on option. I prefer to not use it, to not have that extra panel and so on, but to really just use the server and work on that.